Cloud Peak, the tallest mountain in the Bighorn Range, is a breathtaking and popular hiking destination. While the majority of hikers head straight up the Tensleep drainage to reach the summit, we decided to take the road less traveled. To avoid the crowds and experience even more of the area's beauty, we opted for the scenic route. Follow along and we'll show you what the route we took looked like, some of the stunning sights along the way, and why we think it was the best route for us. The Bighorn Mountains, located in north-central Wyoming and extending slightly into Montana, are home to the Cloud Peak Wilderness, which safeguards the rugged summits and towering rock faces at the heart of the range. Our journey began at the Battle Park Trailhead, leading us through the Lake Solitude area before flanking the Cloud Peak drainage as we ascended to the peak. We were joined by several friends on the hike to base camp, each with their own plans. The route traverses broad meadows, crosses a few streams, ascends a small ridge, and descends to Grace Lake. From there, it continues northward, following Paint Rock Creek to Lake Solitude, the largest natural lake in the Bighorn Mountains. The trail to and around Lake Solitude is well maintained and fairly heavily used. After leaving Lake Solitude, the trail climbs to a bridge over the stream spilling from the Cloud Peak drainage. To our group's disappointment, instead of continuing on the easy path, we turned here and followed the waterfall up to the lowest lake in the Cloud Peak drainage. Though this section is stunning, it gets steeper than some might prefer, especially with full packs. For the most part, it's grassy without notable challenges, but there are a couple of areas with boulders and talus which edges towards scrambly. Once we reached the lake, we set up camp and called it a day, as we had a birthday to celebrate. The next morning, those of us aiming to summit Cloud Peak set off. We began by following a valley that steadily gained elevation towards the ridge on the southeast side of the Cloud Peak drainage. The valley was open and grassy, bursting with wildflowers, and dotted with stunted evergreens as we climbed through the timberline. As we neared the top, the grass thinned, giving way to the ancient 3.2 billion year old Precambrian basement bedrock dominating the landscape. This complex of Precambrian rocks consists of granitic rocks and metamorphic rocks. Predominantly gneiss, but locally including migmatite, amphibolite, and schist. At the top of the valley, we caught our first good view of the Cloud Peak drainage, with Middle Cloud Peak Lake below us. From this point, the hike became more challenging as we climbed the ridge. The terrain grew steeper, and grassy patches became scarce. But we were happy to be gaining elevation quickly, knowing we still had over 2,000 feet to ascend to reach Cloud Peak summit at over 13,000 feet. As we made our way to the peak, we stayed on the southeast side of the ridge, which offered breathtaking views of the Paint Rock Creek and Tensleep drainages to the south. It was a warm and calm August day. A slight haze from distant wildfires lingered, but the skies were clearer than days leading up to the hike, so we had no complaints. Approaching the spine just south of the peak, our route merged with the more popular trail and we began encountering other hikers. Noting it was peak season, we saw around 40 people in this short stretch, a stark contrast to the solitude we'd enjoyed along the rest of our chosen path, as these were the first fellow hikers we'd encountered this day. As we neared the summit, we encountered patches of snow and sections with an obvious trail. However, most of this part consisted of wide open boulder fields, forcing us to pick our own route. The boulders were generally small and easy to traverse, though a few steeper areas required some hopping and light scrambling. At the summit, we signed the log in the ammo can and soaked in the panoramic views. My favorite view from 13,179 feet was to the east, overlooking Glacier Lake and the Cloud Peak Glacier. The entire hike was filled with stunning peaks, glacial valleys, beautiful tarn lakes, and other landforms that spoke of the region's glacial history. So seeing Cloud Peak Glacier, the last remnant of glaciers in the Bighorn Range, was a cool highlight. The hike back was similar to our ascent, except that we stayed on the northwest side of the ridge flanking the Cloud Peak drainage. This offered exquisite views all along the drainage and was also a little easier going than the southeast side of the ridge, as it had a few grassy areas and cut off a small amount of distance. The more or less constant talus and boulder fields with small grassy patches here and there certainly slowed us down, but overall was a perk because it meant tons of pika. They were out in full force, busy clipping and stashing grass for the long winter ahead. Other notable critter spottings included a few ruffed grouse and marmots. From our base camp at the bottom of the Cloud Peak drainage, we hiked back down along the waterfall. From there, we diverged from our initial route, heading east toward Misty Moon Lake and completing a loop around Elk Mountain to return to the Battle Park Trailhead. This route added several scenic valleys to our hike and allowed us to avoid retracing our steps for all but a short section along the waterfall. This route as a whole was a bit longer and more challenging than the standard approach, but in my opinion, it was well worth it. The scenery was incredible, and the variation between the summit and return routes was a better bang for our buck. Anytime you can add more sights and scenery for roughly the same mileage, it's a no-brainer in my opinion.